Hello and welcome to the Sana Psychological Podcast, your safe space for connection, healing, and growth. Each episode, our experienced clinicians and special guests will share strategies, stories, and resources to support your unique path to well-being. Because at Sana, your mental health matters. Hi everyone, I'm Paige Abbott. Thank you for joining us on this latest episode of the Sana Psychological Podcast. Today we are going to be talking about a topic that I think is a sticking point for a lot of people, and that is the topic of resentment and specifically healing from resentment. To get us going today, I wanted to start us off with a Pema Chodron quote. The quote is, "Feelings like disappointment, embarrassment, irritation, resentment, anger, jealousy, and fear, instead of being bad news, are actually clear moments that teach us where it is that we're holding back. They're like messengers that show us with terrifying clarity exactly where we are stuck. This very moment is the perfect teacher, and lucky for us, it's with us wherever we are." I think these are powerful words, and obviously that quote embodies more than just the experience of resentment, but emotions are messengers, and the emotion of resentment is a very strong messenger. We may not always like what it has to say, and I think that's that terrifying clarity that was referred to in the quote. However, we need these messages. We need these moments to show us where we're at, what's working and what's not working in our lives. So today we are going to be talking about that quiet emotion that can just subtly and softly build within us of resentment. Resentment can sit under the surface for weeks, months, even years. It can show up in our relationships, our bodies, and our thoughts in ways that we don't always recognize right away. In this episode today, we're going to explore what resentment is, where it tends to come from, how it shows up, how it impacts our relationships, and most importantly, how we can begin letting go. Let's start with what is resentment? Well, I think there's a lot of different ways to go about this topic, and it may be worth doing a reflection or journaling prompt on that question of what does resentment mean for you? I can speak to my lived and also professional knowledge and experience, and what I would say is that resentment is a lingering and built up emotional response to feeling hurt, treated unfairly, being overlooked, or taken for granted. It's not just anger. Anger usually comes and goes, it rises quickly and it fades. Resentment, on the other hand, is anger that stays and hangs around. It's anger that hasn't had a voice. It hasn't been processed, expressed, or resolved. It often is associated with thoughts like, that shouldn't have happened. They should know better. They should have done better. Why am I always the one who? Over time, resentment can become this quiet narrative that we carry about someone else or even about ourselves. Resentment usually grows from unmet expectations and unexpressed needs. It's that perfect meeting of the two, where we sometimes knowing it, but mostly not knowing it, are quite rigid in what we're expecting or demanding from somebody or a situation. And when that doesn't happen, we may feel caught off guard and we may suppress that emotional reaction to that. So here we are having these really strong expectations and really strong emotional responses to it that just sit within us. It's no wonder that resentment is such a powerful emotion that can build over time and take up so much space within us because it is big. It's connected to a lot and it can take up a great amount of space. Sometimes we expect people to understand us without saying anything, or we give more than we receive, or we feel disrespected, dismissed, or invisible. Common sources of resentment in relationships can include feeling taken advantage of, feeling unappreciated, repeated boundary violations, unresolved conflict, repetitive conflict, power imbalances or dynamics, or carrying too much emotional responsibility for other people. And sometimes resentment develops from the simplest source, which is when we say yes when we really actually mean to say no. Recently, I was having a text conversation with somebody that I've had a really strained relationship with over the years. And maybe in a future episode on boundaries or relationships, I might explore this in greater depth. To be honest, I sometimes question why I'm engaging in the relationship with this person, which has been so fraught with resentment as well as a lot of feeling. And I made a response to a message. And man, was I grateful for the technology to be able to retract that response. Because later I sat on it and went, I'm not comfortable with that. So I shifted my response, and technology allowed me to change it. But we don't always get that opportunity in real time, real life, real conversations. Sometimes things fly out of our mouth and we feel committed or they feel true when we don't actually mean them. So every time we override our own needs, whether it's to keep the peace or make someone else happy, or because we just haven't taken that moment to really think and connect with ourselves, that little bit of resentment starts to build. And in and of itself, it might not seem like much, but when it keeps happening over and over and over again, those little bits of resentment add up to be a lot. Emotionally, resentment can often feel like irritation that sort of appears quickly, especially around certain people or in certain situations. It can feel like a bitterness or a cynicism or kind of a pretty negative view of people or situations or circumstances. We can feel quite emotionally distant. It can feel like a sense of unfairness or injustice, which we may have a hard time accepting or trying to let go. And it can also look like replaying past situations over and over in your mind. How many times have you, whether in a shower or when you're just doing something else, you keep replaying conversations, coming up with new and different things that you would have wanted to say? Those are prime moments where resentment can build both towards other people, but also towards ourselves, because we are growing this story within ourselves of what happened, how we're feeling, and that resentment keeps that story alive within us of how we are, who we are, and how we feel towards that person or situation. Resentment is not just a mental and emotional experience, it also lives in our body. People may notice resentment showing up as tightness in the chest or jaw, or maybe other muscle groups that are personal and specific to you and your resentment experience. It can show up as headaches or other muscle tension, fatigue that's not really explained by any other reason, a restlessness or an agitation, digestive discomfort or issues, or a general sense of just being on edge. You don't feel like you're able to access this place of softness, grounding, and security within yourself. When resentment lingers, our nervous system can stay in that subtle state of stress or defensiveness, especially around the person that we feel like we're carrying that resentment towards. Behaviorally, resentment can show up in ways that are sometimes indirect. So that might look like withdrawing emotionally, avoiding someone, changing a text message, sarcasm or passive aggressive comments, keeping score in the relationship, overreacting to small issues, or shutting down during conversations. Instead of addressing the original hurt or the issues that are coming up, resentment can leak out through these smaller moments, kind of like little pinpricks in a balloon. I like to think of resentment as this emotional energy that's filling up the balloon. And as it gets more and more full, it needs release. So it'll create or take those little pinprick opportunities to release. It's just that question of how and when. It's not the question of will it? Of course it will. Energy and emotional energy, it needs to move, it needs to be processed. It's not going to sit stagnant forever. Resentment also has a huge impact on relationships, and I think is one of the biggest silent disruptors within relationships. It can slowly erode our sense of trust and closeness and communication with somebody. When resentment grows, we often begin to interpret everything through a very negative lens. Small mistakes start to feel like confirmation of that larger resentment story. They don't care about me. They don't listen. This isn't a good relationship. Over time, people can feel emotionally disconnected without always understanding why or where that's coming from. Letting go of resentment is definitely not easy. I would say, in my observation, it's one of the harder, maybe even the hardest emotions for us to process and work towards letting go of. Sometimes resentment almost feels protective. It feels like proof that we were wronged. It can feel tied to our sense of fairness or justice. But ultimately, holding on to resentment just ends up hurting the person carrying it, as well as the situation and the relationship that it exists within. So letting go doesn't mean saying that what happened was okay. It just means that we're deciding not to keep carrying the emotional weight of it moving forward. So, how do we start to do this? You may be sitting there and you have a specific relationship or situation in mind where you are actively feeling that sense of resentment. I want you to take a minute to connect and identify how resentment shows up for you in your body, in your thoughts, in your feelings. These are questions that you can take outside of these moments of the podcast. Maybe do some journaling or some quiet reflection on it. Get to know that emotional experience of resentment. One of the main ways that we can process emotions through is by letting them come. And resentment is no different than any other. We need to let it come and we need to know what it is before we can even start to work on letting it go. So once you are more familiar with how resentment shows up, if resentment is even there within your experience, then we can start to look at what do we further do to keep supporting ourselves in transitioning it. There's certainly no instant or quick fix when it comes to navigating that big feeling of resentment, but there are steps that can help. One is, again, to come back to naming the resentment once you've identified that it's there. Ask yourself, what exactly am I holding on to? Try to identify the specific moment or moments, the expectation or expectations that you might have been carrying, as well as the unmet need underneath and around that emotion of resentment. What was it that you were expecting and looking for that you didn't get in that moment or from that person or from that situation? What was that like for you? What did you actually need instead in that moment? This clarity helps to start to reduce some of that emotional fog. Another step we may want to take is acknowledging the underlying hurt. We can think of resentment as a secondary emotion in some ways, meaning that it's an emotion coming out of other emotional experiences. Underneath or around our resentment, we might be more actively feeling a sense of sadness or disappointment, hurt, rejection, abandonment, feeling unimportant. There may be other emotions connected with this experience that can tie back into what were those unmet needs. If we were feeling sad, We clearly had some sort of need that would have been preferred in that moment that wasn't met. And that brought us to that place of sadness, almost a bit of a grief and loss experience where what we would have wanted to see didn't happen. Allowing yourself to recognize that deeper feeling can help to start softening the resentment. And that's key in healing from resentment is resentment can be so hard. Not only is it big, but it's quite rigid. It doesn't have softness. And when an emotion doesn't have softness to it, it doesn't have pliability. We're not able to shift it. We're not able to mold and sculpt it and therefore move it and heal from it. So allowing things to start to soften and move behind that wall of the resentment and the anger to that softened place of whatever else is going on emotionally helps us to start to shift it and move it through in a different way. Something else you may want to do is to reflect on your expectations. More often than not, resentment grows from expectations that we may not have actually even identified for ourselves. And certainly, they were usually never communicated or expressed. They were also never met. So, that disconnect between our expectations and what happened is that space where resentment shows up in. We can maybe reflect on what were those expectations? Were they fair? Were they realistic? Did we communicate them? And if not, again, rather than blame or shame or beat ourselves up, can we come back to that space of gentleness, of softness, now with ourselves as well as with the other, to see that it's not really fair to expect something from somebody that we may not have even been aware of. We didn't communicate, and now we're holding them to this standard that we've never talked about. So maybe this creates some opportunity for some empathy, some acceptance, and in the future, perhaps more communication might be helpful to open up that honest communication and reduce the propensity for future resentment to build. Boundaries is another key area for healing from and also preventing resentment from continuing to grow. Resentment can signal that a boundary or some different boundaries may be needed within ourselves and or within relationships. That might look like saying no more often, especially when we're saying yes instead, asking for help, sharing our needs earlier on in the relationship or the process, or reducing what you give when it's not reciprocated by the other person. So changing our output based on what's being input. Healthy boundaries can definitely prevent resentment from building in the first place, but they can also help us in the healing process. If we're continuing to engage in a relationship in the exact same way as before, while carrying this big, hard stone of resentment within us, there is the likelihood that more resentment will just keep building. We may need a little bit more flexibility, time, or space in that relationship or from that person in order to be able to start to look at resentment and experience this emotion of resentment differently. You may want to consider communication, as we talked about earlier. If the relationship matters, maybe there's something here that you could address more directly. You could bring it up in the sense of how you felt, what you needed, and what might help moving forward. If this helps shift things from a conversation of blame to one of understanding, that may help not only heal the active resentment, but also prevent future resentment from building. Now, unfortunately, it may be likely or possible that in trying to bring up some of these feelings with somebody, we are not met with empathy, understanding, acceptance, or openness. We might be met with defensiveness, judgment, criticism. It might get thrown back at us. And I know that this can be painful. This can also be information and that clarity that the Pema Chodron quote was telling us earlier. These feelings, while terrifying, also do show the reality of where things are at and what might be possible as well as not possible in that relationship. Ultimately, with resentment, we want to actively choose release. So letting go is a process, and it is also a decision, and one that you may actively need to keep making over and over and over again. Part of your brain wants to hang on. It wants to latch on to that hard rigidity of the resentment. There's a biochemical effect that comes from hanging on to these strong emotions. But if we can choose to see, this is going to hurt me more than it's going to help, that can actively start to create that openness and that softening. We may use further tools such as journaling, gentle reflection, meditation, affirmations, different self talk, talking things through with someone that you trust, practicing compassion and self compassion, practicing empathy, simply allowing things to move that emotional intensity forward with the passage of time and with some of these active tools. Releasing yourself from resentment, it doesn't mean that you agree with what happened. It doesn't even mean that you're okay with what happened. It means that you have chosen to accept this was the reality of the situation or the relationship, and you are going to deal with it moving forward with the information that you have available to you. You'll choose your boundaries accordingly. You'll choose your emotional tools in coping accordingly. But hanging on to resentment brings us back to that Buddhist quote. It's like drinking the poison and expecting the other person to die. Ultimately, resentment hurts ourselves. It hurts our relationships. It hurts everything that's going on around and within us. So this process of choosing release, we're not just choosing to release resentment. We're not releasing the other person from what they've done. We're releasing ourselves. We're releasing ourselves to live our life, to be free from this weight of resentment within us. And I don't know about you, but I think we are all worthy of that choice. We deserve as much freedom as we can get. I really appreciate you being here to discuss this topic of resentment. I know it's a big one, and I'm sure that we will come back to it in future episodes of the podcast. Resentment is a very human experience. Most of us carry it at some point in different relationships and at different situations. You're probably carrying some of it right now, whether you're tuned into that or not. But it doesn't have to define our relationships or our inner world. When we learn to recognize it, understand it, and address the needs underneath it, we create room for something healthier: honesty, boundaries, and deeper connection. Thank you so much for listening today. I really appreciate you being here. And if this episode resonated with you, take a moment this week to do some reflection, check in with yourself using some of the questions and some of the prompts brought up today around this topic of resentment. Is there any resentment you might be ready to start releasing? Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We really appreciate the listen, the follows, the community, the engagement. However you want to connect with us, we really appreciate you being here. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Take care. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the Sana Psychological Podcast. We're glad you joined us today. For more resources, free tools, or to book a session with our team, visit sanapsychological.com. Your mental health is our priority. Until next time, be gentle with yourself and take good care.